Okay, with our system sorted out, what we can do now is go through and start designing the dust particle system that is going to be kicked up from this base of this funnel here, and also from the barn itself when the slats and the roof tiles start moving. Obviously there's going to be some small kind of pieces of fragmentation, small pieces of debris and dust that are going to be nested between the slats. So therefore what we can do is we can simply just emit particles that are going to be stationary on these pieces of geometry and lock them onto the geometry itself, and then once they actually start moving, then pipe them into the next event. Similar kind of process that we did with the just bring this guy up with the for example the speed test here. We'd actually use a position object operator to scatter them over the on the edges of the geometry, so that when the objects start moving we can basically pass them to the next event and make them renderable, and also get them to be sucked inside the vortex. Okay, so to do that, what I'm going to do is we can actually use the position of this one of these PF source icons that are already located in the scene down here. So what we can do is have the speed kind of working exactly the same kind of way as we had previously. So we've got this kind of out force going out from this particle system that's located down here. So we've got this, they're being forced out with another speed operator. Similar kind of process, like I say, what we did in this section down here. Okay, so because we've obviously got this icon already in situ, what we can do is just copy one of the icons across, and then obviously we've still got all the properties already set up in here, which we'll tweak in a second. So I'm just going to grab hold of this guy here, and I'm just going to copy it across, just the icon itself. So I'm just going to copy it. Let's actually redraw the particle view, and I'm going to rename this. Let's call it PF source barn tear debris. So basically it's the debris that's been, or in essence, torn off the barn when these guys start moving. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to have two specific subsystems within this one main system here. One to basically suggest that the particles are slightly bigger, and other one for the more finer debris. Okay, so what we'll do first is let's just drop in a birth event in here, and this one we're going to call, let's name that as debris placement 01, and we'll set another one in here as well, and let's call that debris placement 02. Okay, we'll leave the ticks in here as it currently stands. Obviously these guys aren't going to be renderable. They're going to be renderable when they actually start moving and get past to the next event. So as we had that kind of thing set up already in the past by the speed test, what we can do is we can simply just copy this guy and let's paste it across here. So I'll instance it across to that one, and then I'm going to wire the input of these guys to the output of this barn tear debris. Let's just make sure we've got that in there. There we go, and then you as well. Okay, because we're going to have a fair amount of particles in the viewport, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to set the viewport percentage value. I'm actually going to drop that all the way down to say, let's say about 1%, and the render I think we'll leave as is, but the actual debris placement in the birth, what I want to do is set the emit stop to 0, and the amount I'm actually going to set to let's say 150,000. Okay, and same deal in here. I'm going to set that to 0 as well, but in here I'm actually going to set the amount to, let's set that to 15,000. Okay, so this is going to be the finer dust and debris, and this is going to be the larger dust and debris, which is obviously going to be a smaller amount than this guy over here. Okay, so to get the particles scattered across the geometry, what we need to do is we need to introduce a position object operator in here, and because we obviously need to make sure that the particles are locked onto the object, okay, so that when they actually start moving, because they're obviously locked onto the moving objects, they are then tested by the speed tests. We need to enable this guy here, lock on emitter, and then simply say, right, we need to load in obviously all the objects into this guy over here, but first we need to say where the particles need to be located. So because we're dealing with pretty much almost like rectangular shaped objects, we can basically say, okay, we want the location to be on the edges of the geometry. Okay, so in essence they're going to be positioned on the sides and given the illusion that they're actually in between the gaps between the slats and between the roof tiles, even in where the breaks are. Okay, so what we need to do now is we basically need to introduce pretty much every single piece of geometry within our barn by clicking on this by list button and then just do by name. And what we need to do is, we don't need any of these building remaining ones, we actually just want the stuff from the inner beams, all of these guys down to there. Okay, so that's going to sit there for a second and load all of those objects into our emitter objects list. So it might take a little bit of time depending on the speed of your system, but that's got all of those guys in there. And what we can now do, because we've got all this stuff set up in here, what we can simply do is just copy the position object operator, and what we can do is just paste it across to this debris placement O2. Now I don't want to instance it, reason being is because what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in a new seed value in this guy over here, so that the particles are within this event and the next one that is obviously going to be passed to are distributed with a different seed value, distributed in different position. So I'm going to click on that guy, that's dropped in a new seed value, so therefore the particles are going to be distributed in different positions. Okay, so that's that one pretty much set up. So what I'm going to do at this stage is I'm just going to go to the camera viewport and I'm just going to close this left floating panel there, and I'm going to enable this, and this will sit there for a second and distribute, there we go, all the particles in here and here over the geometry. Obviously bear in mind we're only seeing 1% of the total amount. Okay, so if I just play through, I'll just scroll through here, so you can see the particles are obviously locked onto the objects, and say it's updating quite slowly. So if I turn off real time and play forward, you should be able to see these guys just going through from one frame to the next. Like I say, it takes a little bit of a time for it to calculate, so obviously bear that in mind. If you decide to just suddenly scrub forward to like frame 140, it will take a little bit of time. Obviously bear in mind that we are dealing with 1% of the particles, so obviously when it comes down to render time we'll obviously have a lot more here, and bearing in mind we only want these particles to be emitted from these guys, we don't want them to be fully tracked by these guys. Okay, so all the motion is going to be dealt with a separate set of events down here, which we'll set up now. So the first thing we want to do, so I'm just going to turn this guy off. I'm going to set up I'm going to make these particles renderable by adding in a shape operator in here, which is this guy, and then I'm going to choose that, and then I'm going to set the size. Okay, I'm going to set it to a pretty low value, something like a value about 0.4. Okay, the shape itself I'm actually going to set to cube. Now this debris system, and also the next one that we're going to produce for the intake debris, and also the dust that's kicked off by the ground, and any other kind of airborne stuff, bear in mind that it's simply just renderable cubes that we're going to be dealing with. At a later date you might want to take this into a volumetric renderer or a point renderer to improve on this, like, you know, add facing particles to it to basically give the indication of dust and smoke, in which case you might want to reduce the amount of particles. However, for this particular example, what I'm going to do is just have a fair amount of particles in the system that are going to be quite small, that are going to whirl around our vortex, which will basically give the indication of kind of fine particular matter. Okay, so this one I'm going to rename. I'm going to call that debris airborne 01. Okay, and I'm going to wire the output of this guy into the input of this one. Okay, and set some variation in size in here by adding in a scale. Okay, and this one I want to basically set the scale value to, let's drop in a large scale variation in there. Actually, let's do it down to about 50%. Okay. Same kind of principle as we had before. We basically want to set the speed in there as well, so let's do that. Let's drop in a speed operator, so we get a nice kind of blowout effect. So what I want to do is I want to set the speed value in this one to 75 with a variation of 75 as well, and obviously the direction I want to basically say, okay, it's icon center out as before. Alright, to break up any kind of uniformity, I'm also going to stick a rotation in there as well, so it's basically reorients the particles a fair amount, so it kind of, just in case we can see any square, well, any cube particles defined within the viewport. Okay, so the next thing I basically need to introduce is the additional forces to obviously get the particles to swirl around the vortex. Now to do that, what I want to do is drop in a force operator into here, and this is going to start dropping in the two core debris space warps that I mentioned at the towards the beginning of this tutorial. So we get a nice kind of breakup of distribution. Alright, I'm going to drop this influence down to 500% because I don't want it as strong as it is by default. Okay, and then one last space warp to drop in, and that is going to be, let's actually just drop that in there first. And the space warps that I want to drop in is the vortex dust. Okay, and I also want to drop in the wind intake debris as well. Okay, so we've got a lot of variation going on in here. So we've not only got the vortex that's spinning the particles around, but we've got the two vortex, we've got the two wind core debris space warps in here, and we've also got an additional one in here which is going to break it up even further. Okay, so same kind of principle as before. We don't want it that strong, so let's drop that down to 500. Okay, next thing we need to introduce is we need to make sure that these guys don't pass through the ground plane, so we want to make sure that let's just copy this collision test here. I'm going to instance that across. Okay, and I'm also going to make sure that that's there, so that the collision doesn't actually pass through, so the force doesn't basically act before the collision, otherwise the collision would possibly fail. So we might get some leaking going through the base. So the next thing I want to do is just say to the system, right, we don't want these guys lasting forever because obviously they're going to dissipate after time. So what I want to do is I'm just going to set a delete operator in there as well, I think, and we're going to set that to by particle age and set the lifespan to, let's say, about 125 frames, and we'll stick a variation of about 50 in there as well. Okay, because this is the dust matter. In the other event that we're going to set over here, we obviously don't want these guys to delete because they're obviously going to be larger particles. Okay, now what I want to do now, because I'm not actually going to be setting any materials in here, okay, so what if you want to actually go through and set materials for this system, then feel free after we finish the tutorial. However, at this stage, what I'm going to do, I'm simply going to set particle colors because it kind of works at the end of the day. However, if you want to improve on this further, like I say, you might want to go through and assign materials for this entire thing. So I'm going to set the type in here. I'm going to set that to dots, I think, so we can just see it in the viewport easily. And I'm actually going to set this particle color to, let's have a look, let's say you've got a nice kind of brown color in here, so something that I've kind of point sampled from the back plate, and that's going to be an RGB value of about 150, 133, 97. So got this kind of like creamy brown. It's kind of light color that's something akin to the wood texture that we've got in the scene. So that's that sorted out, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to instance this across, and then we can go through and start tweaking some of the values in here, make some of them unique. So I'm going to select this debris airborne, instance that across, make this guy unique. Don't need the delete as I mentioned previously, but we obviously need to set the scale, set the size of the shape to a larger value. So therefore I'm going to make that unique, and I'm going to set this size value to about 1.25. Alright, scale I can leave as is. The speed, I think I'll drop this value down to 50, so I'm just going to make that unique and set that down to 50 with a variation of 50. 50, not 500 in there, and I think I'll actually set a divergence in there at this point. I think I'll set a divergence in there of 20 in there as well, in which case what I think I'll do is I'll do the same thing in here, so we've got like a nice kind of spread when it actually breaks up. This one I think I'll actually just set to 10. Alright, we've got a random 3D rotation in here. However, we might actually see kind of these particles starting out rotated. With these ones you won't really see, it'll be just kind of like a lot of particular matter, but this one I think will actually bin the rotation and replace it with a spin. So I'm just going to drop that guy in there, and I'm going to set the spin to, let's say, value of 250 with a variation of about 100. Okay, last couple of things that we need to do. One is simply bin this wind core debris, because this is dealing with the dust itself. Okay, we actually just want to concentrate on this one for our main larger fragments of like wood and what have you as the thing breaks. So I'm just going to delete that guy, and then let's just set in some gravity, so it pulls these larger kind of debris particles back down to the ground. So I'm just going to drop in a force operator in there and add in the gravity here. Obviously I need the value quite low in comparison with like some of the gravity we've set up previously. So I think the last one we actually set was a value of 40 in here, if memory serves. Yeah, so this one, let's drop that even further down. Let's say that's got an influence value of 10, so it's obviously not a lot at all. Okay, so same kind of principle as before, but I want to tweak this color a touch. I'm going to make this brown a bit darker, so it's less like fine particulate matter and more like a color of the a darker color of the wood even. So I'm going to make that unique, and then I'm actually going to click on this swatch icon, and I'm going to make this darker by, let's just say, I'm going to drag this guy down, maybe make that slightly less blue. I think that should pretty much do it, I reckon. Maybe just increase the saturation a little bit. Okay, I think that'll do for that. So when it actually comes down to it, if I just turn this guy back on, now it should go through our system a lot quicker now if I just play through, quite simply because even though it's going to take a little while to just distribute it, it's now, you notice it's playing through a lot quicker, quite simply because it's just space warps which are handling the distribution now. Now you can see these guys are kind of coming out and starting to swirl around quite nicely. I'll just turn on this guy so you can start seeing these. You should be able to make these guys out if I just select them. There we go. So it's nice kind of defined dust shape in here. You'll notice that one or two of them start coming down to the ground a little bit, quite simply because of the gravitational space warp that we've introduced. But that works quite well. So that's that system pretty much set up. It's obviously speeding up now because it's got less particles to test the speed on. Okay, so what we'll do now, I think, is we'll turn this system off, but so we've got some motion blur when it comes to rendering. I'm just going to select this guy at the root, go to properties, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the image motion blur. So what that enables us is when it actually comes to render time, like we saw in the geometry itself, we've basically got it kind of smears the particles and smears the geometry, so it all kind of blends together. What we'll also do, I think, is because these this geometry is so fine, I think we'll actually turn off cast shadows as well. There's no point in having shadows cast by this fine particular matter. Okay, so I'm just going to turn that guy off as well. So click on OK. So that's applied it, because we've obviously done it to this root event, it's applied it to the entire system. Obviously these guys are not renderable, quite simply because there's no shape operator in these guys. So these particle placement events will not be rendered apart from when they get passed through to these events here.